Melusine by Reid Chapter 13, Terror and Calm. He snatched away his hand and backed in the darkness till he hit the back of his head on the shelf across the wall above the porthole window. His body blocked this, preventing any light from getting into the room. He stood there for a timeless period, his mind at war with himself. It couldn't be, but it was. He had felt it and seen it. Why wasn't he screaming? Why wasn't he running? Instead of doing either, he said in a low, tense voice, "Go away. You must go away quickly." And it went. He heard it. He knew the sound of its movement by now, that whispering, rustling sound, the tissue paper sound. He could follow it without seeing it. It came off the bed onto the floor, away into the far corner, and then where? Up the wall. Yes, he could hear it moving, up this powdery wall, having some difficulty in getting a grip, slipping once, then making it to the ceiling or somewhere. He heard it drag its scaly body out of his room through some aperture that he had planned out in the field yesterday to search for, the hole through which Melusine listened or watched him from her bedroom above. In a state of calm that amazed him, he reached for the torch, found it, and walked out back into the kitchen where his father had now found the candles by touch and lit one. "What the hell took you so long? Couldn't you find it?" "Here," said Roger, hearing his voice come out normally and noticing, as if it belonged to someone else, that his hand was quite steady. His father, irritable now, almost snatched the torch from him. "I'm going to take some saucepans and things into the bedroom to catch the drips," he said shortly. "You light more candles and put them around the place so your sisters won't be scared." He went out. Roger did as he was told. He was not thinking or feeling. It was as if he were watching someone else behaving in an unbelievably controlled way. His hands functioned automatically, lighting the candles, warming the bases of them, and sticking them into saucers and ashtrays he found. His mother came in and helped, not noticing anything strange about him. But then there was nothing to notice. She put Emma to bed, in her own bed, in the girls' room. Roger followed with a lighted candle. Their mother bent over Polly to tuck her in. Somehow she hadn't woken up. A loud clap of thunder, almost right overhead, startled his mother, and she clutched Roger's hand for a moment. Emma whispered, "Mum, I'm scared." "Nonsense, darling, it's only a storm. Just thank heaven your ceiling isn't leaking. Now get to sleep." She kissed her and pushed Roger ahead of her back into the kitchen. Roger could feel a slight trembling in his hand as it touched his shoulder. "Leave the door open," Emma called after them. Roger's mother left the door ajar and sat down at the table. Lightning lit up the room, and for that second the candles were nothing but painted orange flame shapes, giving no light at all. Roger sat opposite his mother. "I must say I think it's too bad," she said in a shrill whisper. "We're paying the earth for this place. It's all very well, all the glamour, but first they might have made sure it's watertight." Roger heard his own voice say levelly, "It's okay, Mum, Dad'll take care of it." "Yes, but where are we going to sleep?" said his mother in the same shrill tone, quite unlike her normal voice, and Roger saw that she was on the point of tears. He got up and stood next to her and put his arm around her shoulders. It was most unusual for her to cry, but he was not surprised nor embarrassed. She had had a bad day, and now she'd been woken up by the storm, and the storm had upset her, and she had nowhere to sleep. "Why don't you go and sleep on the settee in the big room?" She looked up at him. Her face was pale and strained in the candlelight. "But where will you sleep?" "I'll sleep in my own room," he said. The words surprised him, no less than the fact that his voice unexpectedly cracked down into a deeper register. His mother's strange face burst into a smile. "Roger, did you hear that? Your voice has started to break." "Yeah, I heard." "I'll sleep in my own room." Was he mad? But he didn't want to take his words back. His father came in and said he'd moved the bed to a place where the floor seemed dry, and with a bit of juggling with the bedclothes, at least one person could sleep in it, maybe two, if they were right fond of each other, which was a family joke. Roger's mother looked at Roger and then at her husband. "Roger says he's willing to sleep in his old room," she said doubtfully. "Are you, Rog? Really?" "Don't if you'd rather not. I can sleep sitting up." "It's okay, Dad. I'm not worried about it, honestly." He got a kiss from each of his parents. and the torch from his father. Then they all went their separate way. Then they all went their separate way. Then they all went their separate ways. Roger stood at the door of his room and waited for panic. None came. He opened the door with only normal caution and shone the torch all around the little room. The only trace of the visitation of the snake's visit was a curious dent in his pillow, narrower than that made by a human head. That gave him a slight shiver, but nothing much. He entered, walked past the bed, and into the farthest, by day, darkest corner beyond the bed's foot. He shone the torch upward. Yes, there it was. A black, shadowy hole about the size of a large rat hole or a small rabbit hole, right in the corner of the ceiling, 8 or 9 feet off the ground. He turned, pushed the bed across the floor till it stopped against the far wall, and climbed onto it. But it was too low. He could do no more than shine his torch straight up through the hole from a distance of about a foot. He couldn't see anything except the thickness of the ceiling. He could make out the broken laths and the edge of a wooden beam or joist, but the light got lost in the blackness. Suddenly he thought, "She's up there. If she's still awake, she'll see the light. She might be frightened." He switched the torch off and stood on the bed in the dark, listening. Not a sound except the rain and wind. "She knows," he thought. "She knows that I know. Perhaps she wanted me to find out. Otherwise, why did she keep coming into my room? Perhaps she can't help what she does when she's like that, or perhaps she's lonely or frightened." He crouched down on the bed, thinking. Roger had always been fascinated by people who were different. Geniuses, freaks, handicapped people who had to face life with immense problems. Even being brilliant was such a problem, which set them apart from others. He would always watch television programs about such people. His family teased him about it. The twins called him morbid, especially if it was about someone whose difference was visible or awful. He had no answer. Maybe it was morbid, but it seemed as if he couldn't get enough of trying to imagine himself in their bodies and minds. How could you cope with being so different? How did it feel? How could anyone bear it? Roger had once seen a film about a boy without arms or legs. He was not so much horrified as fascinated, because the boy managed. He managed to do almost everything. He was normal inside his head. Most of these apparently unfortunate people that you couldn't imagine being were. "We're just ordinary," they often said in interviews. "We want what everybody wants. We just want not to be laughed at, not to be stared at, to be accepted." Roger always wanted to say to them, "You can't expect people not to stare when you're so different, so interesting." He never had the least inclination to laugh, though. That was something he simply couldn't understand, how people could laugh. It wasn't just that it was cruel or rude. You'd have to have no feelings at all. One of the worst fights he'd ever had with his sisters happened about 3 years ago. He was reading in one of the Sunday supplements about a little boy who had hardly any face due to a disease. That really was horrific. He was staring at a photo of this kid with a hole in the middle of his face where his nose ought to be, and feeling sick, not with disgust so much as with pity, when Polly came creeping up behind him, looked over his shoulder. She let out a great "Yuck!" and began to act up, making sick noises, throwing herself about the room. That made Emma come to look, though Roger tried to cover the photos with his hands, and she did the same as Polly. And Roger had simply seen red. He had leaped up from the table like a madman and grabbed the pair of them and banged their heads together. Of course, they'd started yelling the place down, and that maddened him more. And he had just begun bashing them both, only luckily he was too blazing furious to aim his blows, and most of them had missed. Or he might have really hurt them. Someone had to come and pull him off. Later, his father had a talk with him. "Do you really hate your sisters?" "No. You behaved as if you did." "Well, I hated them when they acted stupid about that little boy." "You attacked them for reacting differently from you. That's being intolerant. That's being a bigot." Bigot was his father's strongest word for anyone he really disapproved of. Nobody seemed to understand. "It's not as if the little boy could hear and be hurt by anything they said," said his mother. "But you were ready to hurt them. That makes you worse than they were." Roger felt crushed and miserable for days afterwards. He had never allowed himself to lose his temper like that again. He'd frightened himself with the violence of his anger. Now, as he crouched on his bed and thought about some of this, it was as if all the years when people who were different had fascinated him, when when he had struggled to understand them and feel what they felt, at least a bit, had prepared him for Melusine. Did her father know? Of course he did. That first night, when Roger had seen the movement under the bed and called the others, Monsieur Serpais had gone white in the face and had vanished back through the connecting door. Perhaps he had gone upstairs to Melusine's room to what? Be angry with her? Tell her she mustn't frighten the visitors? Punish her? But what if she couldn't help it? What if it was like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? What if she had no choice? What if it just happened? Had it just happened this afternoon on the canal? No, she must have made a decision to save Polly, a conscious decision. Or maybe danger triggered it. So that other part of her wasn't evil, no more than she was. She was just like those others, ordinary in her head, but handicapped, wanting to be like everyone else, but cursed with this thing that overtook her, that she could do nothing about, that set her apart from the rest of the world. Poor Melusine, he thought, poor little thing, and he understood why he had no more fear of her, or even of the creature she sometimes was. The fear had just got lost in pity. And that's the end of chapter 13.